There is something about this message that feels different from the others, because the story behind it begins with a photograph, a question that was never supposed to be asked, and a secret that someone believed could remain hidden forever. Something happened last night. Someone looked at your picture for longer than they intended to. Someone carried an image of you into a conversation because they wanted answers they were too afraid to seek directly. They wanted to understand why you had been occupying their thoughts, why certain memories kept returning, why your presence seemed to remain in their mind even when they tried to move forward, so they took your photograph to a psychic. They thought the photograph would reveal something simple. They expected to hear something comforting, perhaps something predictable. They expected the psychic to describe a temporary connection, an emotional attachment, a passing attraction, or a chapter that would eventually fade. But the moment the psychic looked at your photograph, the atmosphere changed. The expression on their face changed. The person who brought the photograph noticed immediately. There was a pause, not an ordinary pause. It was the kind of silence that makes someone wonder whether they should have asked the question at all. The psychic looked at the photograph again, then again, and instead of immediately answering, they asked one strange question: do you really want to know who this person is? That question changed everything, because the person sitting across from the psychic suddenly realized that they had not actually prepared themselves for the truth. They wanted information. They did not expect revelation. They wanted certainty. They did not expect to have their entire understanding of you challenged, and the most shocking part was not what the psychic supposedly saw in the photograph. The most shocking part was what the person realized about themselves after hearing it. They had been looking at you through the wrong lens. They had been judging your silence as weakness. They had mistaken your patience for indifference. They had assumed that because you did not reveal every thought, you must not have been feeling deeply. They thought they understood your heart because they had watched your behavior, but the psychic's words forced them to consider something completely different. What if you had been protecting your heart rather than hiding it? What if your distance was not rejection? What if your quietness was not emptiness? What if the reason you had stopped explaining yourself was because you had finally learned that not everyone deserves access to your deepest feelings? That possibility frightened them, and then came the revelation. The psychic looked at your photograph and said something that made the person sitting there completely still. They said that you were not the person they had imagined you to be. You were not simply someone passing through their life. You were not simply a temporary emotional experience, and you were certainly not someone they could easily replace. According to the story being told, the psychic described you as someone who had already survived a great deal emotionally without allowing that pain to define your future. Someone who had learned to stand alone. Someone who had learned not to beg for attention. Someone who could walk away from situations that once seemed impossible to leave. Someone whose greatest transformation had happened quietly, and that was the part that unsettled them most. Because they remembered the moments when they thought you needed them. They remembered the times they believed you would always remain available. They remembered assuming that no matter what happened, you would eventually return to the same emotional place. But the psychic's words suggested that you had already crossed an invisible line. You were changing. you were becoming more independent emotionally. You were beginning to understand your own value, and once someone truly understands their value, they stop negotiating with situations that constantly make them question it. That realization struck the person harder than expected, because suddenly, the question was no longer, "Does this person care about me?" The question became, "What if this person eventually realizes they deserve something better than what I offered?" That was the thought they could not escape, and this is where the title of this message becomes confusing, because it says their love for you died the moment the psychic revealed who you are, but perhaps that is not exactly what happened. Perhaps something else died. Perhaps the version of their love that depended on control, assumptions, ego, fear, or fantasy was what disappeared. Perhaps the thing that died was the illusion that they could keep misunderstanding you without consequences. Perhaps the fantasy that you would remain exactly where they left you finally collapsed. Sometimes what feels like the death of love is actually the death of an illusion, and when the illusion disappears, the truth has nowhere left to hide. The person who brought your photograph may have entered that room expecting confirmation of their assumptions. Instead, they were confronted with themselves. They were forced to think about every time they ignored an opportunity to communicate honestly. Every time they let pride speak instead of vulnerability. Every time they chose silence because speaking honestly felt too risky. Every time they watched you from a distance rather than asking what was actually happening in your heart. The psychic did not need to know every detail. The photograph itself became a symbol of everything that had remained unspoken, and suddenly the person understood something uncomfortable. You had never been as easy to read as they thought. You had been observing them too. You had noticed inconsistencies. You had noticed changes. You had noticed when words and actions did not match. You had noticed when affection became uncertainty. You had noticed when someone wanted your attention but was not prepared to offer the same emotional honesty in return. You noticed more than you said, and that may be why your silence became so powerful. You did not need to announce every realization. You simply adjusted your distance. You protected your peace. You allowed time to reveal what words could not. That is one of the strongest messages hidden inside this story. Not everything needs to be chased. Not every unanswered question needs to be forced open. Not every person who walks away needs to be pursued. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain grounded while life reveals what you could never have discovered through pressure. The person who carried your photograph into that room may have been searching for certainty. Instead, they received a mirror, and the mirror showed them something they were not ready to see. They saw their own fear. They saw their own hesitation. They saw the consequences of postponing difficult conversations. They saw how often they had allowed outside opinions to influence something that should have been handled through honest communication. And perhaps that is why they became quiet afterward, because revelation can make a person silent, not because they suddenly have nothing to say, but because they suddenly have too much to say. They may have thought about contacting you. They may have opened a message and stared at the screen. They may have written something and deleted it. They may have wondered whether enough time had passed. They may have asked themselves whether you would even listen, but there was another thought beneath all of those thoughts. What if they have already moved on emotionally? That possibility can be more frightening than rejection, because rejection closes a door, but uncertainty leaves a person standing in front of it, wondering whether they should knock. And this story is not asking you to wait at that door, it is asking you to understand the deeper message. You cannot build your future around someone else's uncertainty. You cannot measure your worth by whether another person chooses you. You cannot allow someone else's confusion to become your identity. If someone truly values you, they eventually have to communicate that value through actions, not rumors, not psychic predictions, not secret conversations, not mysterious signs, actions. Real conversations, respect, consistency, honesty, that is where the truth becomes meaningful. So if this message feels strangely familiar, do not interpret it as an instruction to chase someone. Instead, take it as a reminder to protect your own peace, because the person in this story may have discovered something that you have been slowly learning already. You are not responsible for convincing someone of your worth. You are not responsible for making someone understand your heart. You are not responsible for carrying an entire connection alone, and you do not need to become smaller just to make another person comfortable. The photograph may have been taken into that room because someone wanted to know your future. But the deeper revelation was about your present. You are changing, your standards are changing, your understanding of yourself is changing, your relationship with uncertainty is changing, and perhaps the greatest shift is this: you are learning that peace is not something another person gives you. Peace begins when you stop abandoning yourself for the possibility of being chosen. That lesson can completely change the way you experience relationships. It can make you slower to react, more careful about promises, more attentive to behavior, more willing to step away from confusion, and more capable of recognizing genuine care when it appears. The person who brought your photograph may have realized that too. Perhaps they recognized that you were never demanding perfection, you were asking for clarity, you were asking for respect, you were asking for emotional honesty, and those things should never be considered unreasonable. There is another layer to this story. The psychic supposedly revealed that the person in the photograph had a future that could not be controlled by someone else's expectations. That your path would continue regardless of who stayed, that your growth would not stop. Because someone hesitated, that you would eventually reach a point where your emotional world became too valuable to fill with uncertainty, and hearing that may have frightened the person, because they suddenly understood that time was not standing still. You were moving, life was moving, everything was moving, and if they wanted a meaningful place in your life, they could not depend forever on the assumption that you would remain available. That realization may have felt like losing you, but perhaps it was actually the beginning of seeing you clearly. Sometimes people do not recognize someone's importance until they realize that person has the strength to walk away. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, but because they finally understand that staying in confusion is not the same as staying in love. There is a difference, and that difference matters. You can care about someone and still choose peace. You can have feelings and still maintain boundaries. You can hope for honesty without waiting forever. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to your life. You can wish someone well without following them into uncertainty. Those are signs of emotional strength. And maybe that is what the photograph revealed. Not some supernatural prediction. Not a guaranteed future, but a symbol of a person who had become stronger than the version of themselves that once needed constant reassurance. That person is you. And if someone has recently been thinking about you, wondering about you, or asking other people questions about you, remember this: you do not have to participate in every mystery surrounding your name. You do not have to investigate every rumor. You do not have to decode every silence. Let people speak directly when they are ready. Let actions reveal intentions. Let time separate sincerity from temporary emotion. The person who took your photograph may eventually realize that the answer they were searching for could never have been found in a photograph, because a photograph captures a moment. It does not capture someone's entire heart. It does not show every night they spent rebuilding themselves. It does not show every disappointment they survived. It does not show every time they chose kindness after being hurt. It does not show every dream they still carry. It does not show the strength behind their quietness. It does not show the future they are creating. A photograph can show a face, it cannot show a soul, and perhaps that is exactly why the psychic's words were so unsettling. They were not really describing an image, they were describing a possibility. The possibility that the person they thought they understood was much deeper than they realized. The possibility that your silence contained wisdom. The possibility that your distance contained boundaries. The possibility that your calmness was not lack of feeling but emotional maturity. And once that possibility entered their mind, they could not easily remove it. They began remembering things differently. A conversation that once seemed ordinary suddenly seemed important. A goodbye that once seemed temporary suddenly felt significant. A moment when you looked away suddenly seemed like you were protecting something inside yourself. A time when you did not argue suddenly seemed like you had already understood everything. That is how perspective changes. The events remain the same. Only the meaning changes. And sometimes the most powerful transformation happens when someone finally sees an old memory through new eyes. Perhaps that is what happened last night. Perhaps someone replayed the past. Perhaps they realized that they had misunderstood your behavior. Perhaps they recognized that they had been waiting for you to prove your feelings while never giving you enough safety to express them. Perhaps they expected you to chase while they remained uncertain. Perhaps they believed you would always be there. And perhaps the psychic's words made them realize that life does not guarantee that. No one should assume another person will remain available forever. Every relationship requires care. Every meaningful connection requires communication. Every bond needs mutual respect. Without those things, even strong feelings can become buried beneath confusion. So do not become obsessed with the question of whether this person's love died. Ask a better question: what kind of love deserves a place in my future? That question puts your power back where it belongs. A healthy connection should not require you to abandon your dignity. It should not make you constantly question whether you matter. It should not depend on guessing games. It should not make you afraid to speak, and it should not require another person to consult strangers about feelings that could be discussed honestly between two people. If someone wants to understand you, the most meaningful path is communication. If someone wants to know what you feel, they can ask respectfully. If someone wants to rebuild trust, they can demonstrate consistency. If someone wants to be part of your future, they can show up honestly. Those are the revelations that matter, not because they sound mystical, but because they are real, and perhaps the person who brought your photograph is beginning to understand that. Maybe they expected the psychic to tell them whether you were the one. Instead, they were forced to ask whether they had been acting like someone worthy of your trust. That is a much harder question. It requires accountability. It requires courage. It requires admitting mistakes. It requires letting go of pride. And not everyone is ready for that. But whether they are ready or not is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to continue growing. Continue becoming wiser. Continue protecting your peace. Continue listening to your own values. Continue choosing relationships that are respectful and balanced, and continue remembering that your future is larger than one person's decision. There is a beautiful message hidden inside the dramatic title. Someone may have thought they were going to discover your secret. Instead, they discovered that you were becoming a mystery to them because you were no longer living for their approval. That is not a bad thing. Sometimes becoming less predictable to others means becoming more honest with yourself. You stop explaining every decision. You stop trying to convince people who have already decided not to understand. You stop chasing closure from people who refuse to communicate. You stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional health, and you begin choosing peace. That transformation can feel lonely at first. But loneliness and solitude are not the same. Solitude can become a place where you hear yourself clearly. It can become a place where you remember what matters. It can become a place where you rebuild confidence. It can become the space where you realize that your life does not need to revolve around one person's attention. And when you reach that place, something changes. You become harder to manipulate, harder to confuse. Harder to convince that you deserve less than respect. You begin noticing consistency. You begin valuing honesty. You begin understanding that someone's words mean very little without corresponding actions. That is the kind of wisdom no psychic needs to reveal. It is something life teaches. Maybe the person who brought your photograph is learning that lesson now. Maybe they realized they were not actually afraid of losing you. They were afraid of losing the version of you they believed would always wait, and that version may no longer exist. Because you have grown, you have learned, you have changed, and growth is not betrayal. It is life. So if someone comes back into your life with words, listen carefully, but do not let words alone. Decide your future. Look for accountability. Look for respect. Look for consistency. Look for whether their behavior matches what they say. You do not need to punish anyone. You simply need to observe. You do not need revenge. You need clarity. You do not need to prove that you can live without someone. You simply need to live fully. That is where your strength is. And perhaps that is the real secret the photograph revealed. You are not waiting for someone else to complete your story. you are already writing it. Someone may join you. Someone may leave. Someone may return. Someone may apologize. Someone may finally understand what they once overlooked, but your story continues. Either way, that is the part that cannot be taken away, and if this message has found you during a confusing emotional season, let it remind you that confusion does not have to become your permanent state. Give yourself permission to slow down. Give yourself permission to think. Give yourself permission not to react immediately. Give yourself permission to let people reveal themselves. There is tremendous power in allowing time to answer questions that emotion cannot answer. Maybe last night changed something for that person. Maybe it changed their perspective. Maybe it made them question their assumptions. Maybe it forced them to acknowledge feelings they had avoided, but what happens next belongs to their choices, not yours. You do not need to predict it. You do not need to control it. You do not need to wait for it. If they want to communicate, they can communicate. If they want to make amends, they can make amends. If they want to rebuild trust, they can demonstrate why trust should be rebuilt. And if they remain silent, you are